So first, I just want to express some appreciation for people that I've been associated with for many years that have influenced my thinking. And so from a state factor approach, the state of my mental health or ideas is a product or a function of many of the researchers that have gone before, and I express my appreciation to the fellows on this screen. But I've also had the great fortune of collaborating with many young researchers over the course of my career, and they have brought new ideas, new techniques, new analytical approaches to the work, and I've greatly benefited from that. So let's take this week to renew acquaintances, make new friends, share our ideas, and join working groups and foster our collaborations together in the future. So now I'd like to get to my presentation. It's a very short title, Permafrost Ecosystem Interactions for a very complicated idea. And I am including Yuri Shur as co-author because of our collaborations over decades that have helped foster these ideas. So how is it that permafrost can degrade at minus 12 degrees mean annual temperature and yet persist at plus 2 degrees C, spanning the whole length of Alaska from up along our Beaufort Sea coast down to king salmon down along the Alaska Peninsula? And so we see that we can have ice degradation going on at mean annual temperature of minus 11, minus 12, and yet we can have permafrost persist as relic permafrost at mean annual temperature of plus 2. To answer this question, I've been using a state factor approach for soil formation, originally from Dukachev in 1883 and reformulated as from Jenny, where permafrost soils are a function of climate, hydrology, biota, topography, parent material, and time. And the topography and parent material acts as the initial state factors that are then acted upon by external conditions of climate, biota, and hydrology, and the age of the system is determined over time. But these state factors are kind of just general concepts that work from geology, climate, vegetation to interact to affect the surface and subsurface conditions. And these conditions then control the soil thermal regime, which then controls the permafrost response. And then once the permafrost responds, you immediately have feedbacks that go back to affect these state factors. So you can go from climate interaction to interacting with, oh, it's so light here you can't even see it, okay. So climate interacts with topography to affect microclimate, to affect surface water, and organics and water are going to affect thermal properties, which affects the soil heat flux, which then affects degradation, thaw settlement, and that may affect water on the surface and go back to affect thermal properties at the surface once again. So approaches for assessing these permafrost ecosystem interactions that we've used are disturbance studies, experimental manipulations, end factors approaches to measuring soil temperatures and effects of ecological conditions, integrated terrain unit classification to look at the relationships between vegetation, soils, landforms, and permafrost. And then to address time, we use a chronosequence sampling, and I'm going to provide some examples from floodplains, ice wedge dynamics, fire, and thaw lake plains. And you can use thermal modeling to help isolate the sensitivity of various parameters from these state factors, and then remote sensing time series to look at changes over time as permafrost interacts with the ecological conditions at the surface. So the permafrost response to disturbance, a very nice example of that was the work initially started with Linnell, where it did a vegetation and soil removal experiment. And they reported that in 1973, and then Tom Douglas and I and some others revisited this work. And there were three conditions. One is undisturbed forest, another just removing the vegetation, and the other with removing the vegetation and soil. And so in this experiment, the permafrost soil was mostly a function of changes in biota over time, where in the other conditions were held constant. And here we see over a progression of 61 years, the vegetation soil thawed down to 9.8 meters, but where just only vegetation was removed, initially the thaw depths extended to 4.7 meters, but subsequently permafrost has started to grade at about 1.8 meters and is currently almost 2 meters thick. We can also look at some impacts of human activities, impacts of winter seismic. In this example, cat trains were used for seismic exploration in the Arctic Refuge in '84 and '85. And the cat trains have particularly caused some surface damage, mostly limited to scuffing of the surface. The soils were frozen. And revisiting that 20 years later, you can see that there are persistent impacts across the tundra from just this fairly minimal disturbance from the winter seismic activity. And we can rate that disturbance across various vegetation types from moist sedge tundra over to dryas terraces. And the black bars on the lower graph are kind of these level 4 disturbances that include thermokarst tract depression. And we see that is most prevalent in vegetation of moist sedge dryas tundra and going to tussock tundra. And this thermokarst is absent in the other vegetation types. Well, I did coring along these trails in 1985, and it turns out 20 years later that the ice core data was the best explanatory variable for the long-term outcome of these vegetation impacts. So showing that even under very cold climate conditions, the permafrost can be very sensitive to ecological conditions at the surface. Also use the N factor approach. It's been quite a wormhole, went down that wormhole for a while, where tried to measure or measured soil temperatures both at the soil surface and at the, near the top of the permafrost. And in this example, we tried to isolate the effects of topography and vegetation and used a nested design where had four landscapes, riverine, lowland, upland, south facing, and upland north facing. And then within each one of those landscapes, instrumented shrublands, broadleaf forests, and needleleaf forests. And from this example, we can see there are fairly large differences in air temperatures or soil temperatures in the winter and soil temperatures in the summer among these vegetation types within these physiography. And what we've found is winter temperatures tend to be cooler in the lowlands. Part of that's adiabatic lapse rate and colder temperatures sinking to the valley floors. And in summer, scrub had the warmest temperatures and needleleaf forest had the coldest temperatures. In terms of N factors, if you compare these across these two conditions, we find that N factors for thawing N factors can vary twofold across the landscape vegetation conditions, and freezing N factors could vary fourfold across these. Doing a stepwise regression approach, we found significant factors affecting the N factors were successional stage related to vegetation development, potential incitation related to topography, soil organic thickness, and drainage. Whereas the N factor in the wintertime was affected only significantly by snow depth and by elevation, and snow interacts with elevation. We kind of confirmed these interactions with some thermal modeling, with Vlad using his GPL model to assess the effects of vegetation on ground temperatures, and we parameterized the model with the soil conditions, soil properties from our field studies. And we found that soil temperatures at the surface could vary by about 6 degrees across vegetation types from barren landscapes to the coldest tussock bogs. And when we included data from surface field measurements for water bodies, we could have as much as a 12-degree effect from ecological conditions from the surface when you compare the coldest landscape of tussock bogs to the warmest portion of the landscape, deep water bodies. So here we're demonstrating that the effects of ecosystem properties are nearly twice as large as predicted climate change. And we can also use that N-factor modeling in distributed estimations of soil temperatures, and here's a map of soil temperatures at the surface, -3 centimeters, and a deep soil temperatures at the top of the permafrost. And it uses the T-top model that Reisenborough improved upon the earlier approach that I had developed. The advantage of the N factors is that they're sensitive to topography and vegetation type, or we can put in some coefficients reflecting those components. But the disadvantage is it's a yearly time step and lacks subsurface temperature profiling. And from this modeling, the model results indicate that we have about 4 to 5 degrees of variation of soil temperatures, both at the surface and deep, related to both vegetation and topography. We've used field studies to examine the relationships between landforms, vegetation, soil, and permafrost, and here's an example of work related to oil field baseline studies up along the Beaufort coastal plain, where we're finding quantitative relationships between vegetation composition, which we aggregate into vegetation types, the soil classification and conditions, and the ground ice characteristics. And we make a nice little conceptual model of how these co-vary across the landscape. And we can use those co-varying relationships in a terrain unit mapping approach. And here, when we're dealing at the site scale detailed level mapping, we can associate permafrost soils as a function of hydrology, biota, biology, topography, parent material, and time being expressed as the age of the geomorphic unit, all within a similar climate. So we're eliminating the effects of climate within this landscape. And here we've grouped our ecosystem types into riverine types. The lacustrine are in green and yellow that represent old ice-rich basins versus young productive ice-poor basins. And then we have the pink and purple representing coastal dynamics. The benefits of integrating the vegetation landform soils is being able to partition the variability of ground ice. And here we've calculated the thaw strain percentages by terrain unit. So we're only using the terrain unit or landform component, geomorphic unit of kind of this ecosystem mapping. And we find almost tenfold variation of ground ice volumes across sites where the Aeolian sands and sandy active channel deposits have extremely low thaw strain values. And when we get to the more organic silt-rich deposits, say a delta inactive overbank deposit, have thaw strain values of 50 to 60%. What's notable about this is the extremely high variability, coefficient of variation associated with these. It's really a problem that we have to grapple with across scales. And to illustrate that point, here's just an exposure of the old surface in the Fish Creek area, NPRA, and depending on where you core along this bluff, you could get radically different ice contents, going from ice wedges to, next to the ice wedge, we could have almost pure silt that gets deformed up there, go another meter, and it could be organic matter for 2 meters, or the center of the wedge, we could have organic disrupted materials going way deeper. So extremely high variability on the scale of meters, and that becomes an extremely problematic issue for trying to come up with either mean values or any site-specific predictions of what's going to be underneath your feet at any one spot. We can go up to the next level of trying to map permafrost and these terrain relationships at the landscape scale. And here's an example of the mapping that we've done for northern Alaska. It's another integrated terrain unit that uses topography geomorphology. And we try to break the geomorphic units into ages. So here, permafrost soil is a function of climate because we're going from Arctic to boreal systems, and it's a function of topography and parent material. But we start having to develop more complex models of terrain relationships, concepts that go with these map units. And here's an example of a couple illustrations from Misha Konevsky illustrating the general stratigraphy related to geomorphology and the ice content distribution across a coastal plain environment and a braided floodplain environment. And these units can be reparameterized here in this illustration. It's maximum potential thaw settlement, where we have sand dune deposits on the sand sheet on the coastal plain where our potential thaw settlement is within the top 5 meters is relatively low, less than half a meter. Or on the other extreme, in loess deposits or in glacial deposits with buried glacial ice, the potential thaw settlement can be 5 to 30 meters. And so we can relate these field measurements to these map units. And we can broaden this mapping to the regional scale. It's a map of permafrost in Alaska for the ICOP meeting, where permafrost soil is a function of climate and parent material, and we're not able to deal with the heterogeneity of hydrology, biology, or topography. And here in the lower right is a simple conceptual model relating a geomorphic unit to mean annual air temperature, and we were able to relate our probability distributions of ice extent based on a climatic parent material relationship. Neil Pastic has taken this approach another step farther, using remote sensing, Landsat data, and field data, and then using a decision regression tree modeling, incorporating 28 environmental variables based on the analysis of permafrost relationships at 16,000 field observations compiled from numerous studies. And here we're making a permafrost soil be a function of climatic indices, hydrologic indices, vegetation indices, topography. But we have not been able to incorporate parent material because we don't have any sufficiently high-resolution maps of superficial geology, and we're not incorporating time. So how do we deal with time and the effects of time and landscape evolution? One approach is we can use a chronosequence, kind of a space for time substitution. And in this approach, we're trying to control just for changes in vegetation and time and maintain climate and hydrology, topography, and parent materials as uniform conditions. And here we have a transect that extends from a river channel to barren channel deposits through active floodplain with tall willow to an inactive floodplain with dominated by wet sedge, and then we go to this higher floodplain step, and eventually the landscape accumulates so much ice that it becomes unstable and can degrade into thaw lakes. So here's just a topo sequence illustrating these relationships across a transect where we have a series of boreholes, and we were able to relate geomorphology to the vegetation structure, to the soil, texture and lithofacies, and than the cryostructures that go with it. And this transect, our basal date at the farthest inland site was 4,100 years. So this 4,000 years of evolution of ground ice. And we can partition different morphologies of this ice through these topo sequences, where we start with pore ice in the sandy sediments along the river channels, develop lenticular ice in early active floodplain stage, and then develop more complex, more ice-rich structures at the later floodplain stages. And we end up with very extremely ice-rich soils with ataxitic ice at the end. We can quantify the frequencies of changes along this evolutionary pathway, where the delta riverbed is mostly dominated by pore ice in terms of percent of total core lengths across all cores. And in contrast, the active floodplain, the one in the middle, here is dominated by lenticular ice, and as we go to the inactive floodplain, we're mostly frequently encountering layered vein, some articulate, and some ataxitic. And then at the inactive, at the badness stage at the end, it's mostly extremely ice-rich organics, called organic matrix ice, with abundant reticulate and ataxitic soils. And we can see that the mean ice volumes also increase over time from about 40% in the sandy riverbed material to over 80% in the abandoned floodplains. We can wrap this up into a conceptual model where we're looking at the changes in sediments and lithofacies among these floodplain steps, and then the changes in ice structures. And one important aspect of the evolution of floodplains is the accumulation of silts in overbank environments, and these are very susceptible to segregation ice and can almost expand 2 to 3 times in volume with the accumulation of ice over time. And we also have the accumulation of ice wedges across these floodplain steps. So we end up with an interaction of decreasing active layer depth, increasing organic accumulation, increasing ice contents, but then these will feed back to the hydrologic parameters and causing decreasing flood frequency and decreasing sedimentation. So for every action, there's a reaction in these ecological relationships. And this accumulation of ice over thousands of years in the upper 2 to 3 meters of permafrost we can refer to as an intermediate layer. So next I'd like to examine some of the ground ice ecological feedbacks that control ice wedge dynamics. And here we have a very thin active layer over a large body of massive ice, of wedge ice. Working with Uri over periods in the delta and then over in the NPRA, kind of the western portion of the coastal plain, we started identifying this ice wedge degradation in the late 1990s, and we conceptualized that these were occurring in various stages, that they were evolving from each other. And we identified an initial stage of degradation where the thawing of the transient layer right above the ice wedge was releasing nutrients and causing the screen flush of tussocks along these wedge systems, and followed by sufficient thawing of the ice wedge to cause these thermokarst pits. But then they would be quickly colonized by aquatic sedges, and then followed up by advanced stabilization, where the ground cover was succeedingly covered by mosses and sphagnum in particular. So we looked at the changes in environmental variables over these times and developed kind of a conceptual model of where we go from an undegraded ice wedge that's protected by this transient layer, so you have seasonal thaw that doesn't get down to the ice wedge. But in extremely warm summers, this can thaw through the transient layer down to the wedge and start causing initial degradation, and that meltwater goes to the surface or runs off. And then we can have further degradation that causes water impoundment. And then our stratigraphy started revealing we were accumulating new organic material and also new ice cryostructures above the ice wedge. To get a handle on when this was being onset or what's the progression of it, at many sites, Barrow to Prudhoe, Fish Creek, Jago, we've used a time series of air photos to analyze changes in water-filled pits associated with this thermokarst. And here we have a series of photos going from 1949 to 2012. And the fourth one in the series is 1988. And then by 1997, we have substantially more pits. And by 2004, we have even more. And it's slowly increased since then. If you chart that on a graph, we have very little change in these thermokarst pits from 50s to early 80s, and then after that we have this abrupt increase that's extended towards 2012. We relate this onset of this abrupt degradation to extremely warm weather in 1989. That's in this lower bar graph, and it's very much above the normal thermal regime. And then also we had another big spike in extremely warm summer temperatures in 2004. So to assess the feedbacks in succession through the sequence, we've done vegetation measurements of cover at the species stage, and we use a non-metric dimensional scaling to kind of bundle or partition the vegetation composition among these stages, and we find very nice grouping of the vegetation in conjunction with these thermokarst stages, where over on the left we have the polygon centers in red and undegraded troughs that are clustering with similar composition. And then our first initial degradation, these light blue dots down towards the bottom, and the species composition is shifting over to these aquatic mosses, preliminary and aquatic forbs during the advanced degradation stage that are submerged at the bottom, at the floor of the pits. And then with continued stabilization, it gains the sedges, aquatic grasses, Depontia, and starts going back towards original conditions. And we can see that various environmental parameters are shifting through this sequence, where the subsidence, changing the relative elevation of the surface, accumulates water. The water increases the heat flux almost sixfold, and we have a change in temperatures at the surface of the soils, even underneath the pits, variation of almost 6 degrees across these vegetation types, directly related to water depth. And then temperatures are also somewhat sensitive to organic surface thickness, so as we start accumulating new sedge peat later in the sequence, it reduces the temperatures and allows ice to regrade. But this cave ice that we see associated with this degradation of ice wedges, we're now understanding that it's a common or frequent occurrence in our exposed ice wedges. So it's indicating that this ice wedge degradation and stabilization is a repeating process, that it's happened in the past, and we have yet to kind of fully understand what the temporal sequence of this degradation and stabilization is. And in lowland landscapes, we can use paleo indicators of permafrost history, where we both use plant macrofossils, soil structures, and cryostructures, radiocarbon dating to assess changes over time. And in the Yukon and Oko Flats, we've developed a conceptual model of a degrading Yetama landscape that goes from extremely ice-rich silts to thermokarst lake development. These lakes drain, but during the drainage process, it creates very heterogeneous environments that can aggrade and then subsequently degrade at different periods. So the main message here is that ecosystems, particularly in these drained lakes, affects how permafrost degrades, and then this future ground ice and permafrost aggradation affects how we have the ecological transitions in the future. And it results in a high degree of patchiness with very different environmental histories that's been increasingly frustrating for us in how we use the toposequence approach. And then lastly, in fires, we've been studying effects of fires on permafrost on the Tanana Flats, also trying to use a chronosequence approach. And here we were studying a 2010 fire that is the first time in my experience where we see the surface collapse down below the water level as a result of the fire within 1 year. And we also partition the vegetation variability among these time sequences from 1930 to 75 to 88 to 2001 and 2010. And we find some general relationships of organic carbon related to ages, with more organic carbon in the older ages after recovery, and some variation of the temperatures where the recent fires are warmer than areas burned 30 years ago or 70, 80 years ago, and same with bottom temperatures. But once again, we're finding large differences in soils related to the permafrost histories, and that's complicated our ability to really use the chronosequence approach. So lastly, Dana Nossoff used the GIPL model with the help of Vlad to try to partition the variables of climate and parent material, kind of the silt and soil coverage, and look at these interactions of materials and time. And in this case, we varied the organic layer thickness for 4 conditions and ran the model incorporating the time variability from 1930 to 2010. And we find as we have more severe fires with resulting in less organic layer thickness at the end, that we increase the sensitivity of the system to degradation. But we also see that there's still a climatic effect where in the less moderately severe fire, we have some small permafrost recovery near the surface in 2004 and 5. And in the highly disturbed fire conditions with no organics at the surface, we had some permafrost recovery in the 60s and 70s. So we still have this interaction of climate parent materials over time. And we've seen that that was a modeling example, but we have observations in the field that indeed we have instances where permafrost is reaggraded and jacked up the surface. Here's a photo from 2004 with permafrost reaggrading, immediately jacking up and killing the sedges, and saw the same thing out in Kantishna Flats in 2014, where cold temperatures in 2004, 2006 range with low snow resulted in permafrost reaggrading. So I'm going to skip through the rest and just come to a conclusion. And that's that we have an interaction between climate and ecosystems that results in very different permafrost dynamics. Kind of on the left, we go from early successional at the top to late successional at the bottom. Disturbance reverses that, and the types of permafrost that develop depend on the climate. So in very cold climates, even at early successional stages, we have permafrost develops that we term climate-driven permafrost. In a little warmer Arctic conditions, we have permafrost that can be modified by ecosystem processes like I illustrated on the Colville Delta. And when we get to boreal regions, ecosystem processes become more important in driving the permafrost distribution. But we can have permafrost like Yetima that's maintained from an earlier cold environment and protected by ecosystem processes. And finally, when we get to a very warm climate, we only find permafrost in late successional stages protected by ecosystem properties at the surface. So thanks very much.